Well, thank you very much for asking me back to the BPS again. I see some people in the room who are definitely not registrars in clinical pharmacology and training, but you're all very welcome, and I'm pleased to see you, and even some people from abroad as well. I'm going to pick up on some of the points that Martin has made and some of the points that Duncan has made about regulation. And I've called this Why Regulatory Science Matters, because I believe that regulatory science is important. Now, by regulatory science, this is the standard definition, the development of new tools, standards, and approaches to assess the safety, efficacy, quality, and performance of regulated products. And this applies not only to pharmaceuticals, but also to medical devices and diagnostics as well. And the reason is that these embody what I would call a commonality of issues. Firstly, it's clearly important that regulation follows science. When regulation gets into trouble, it's when it doesn't follow science and it tries to deviate from that. Secondly, and this is especially true for medical devices, regulation must always accommodate changes in the nature of products. If you look at how medical devices change quite dramatically over the course of their life cycle, then regulation must be able to accommodate for that. And thirdly, a very obvious statement that regulatory science varies in maturity in different countries. And it's very interesting that there is now a movement to set up centres of regulatory excellence in different parts of the world which will incorporate the best of regulation in these different areas. And we might come back to that in discussion. So there are what I would call three frameworks of regulation. As I said already, regulation is based on science, but it's underpinned by the law. But you must remember that regulation has really got no purpose at all unless it serves the public health. So in this context, you can say that the regulator has three distinct roles. The traditional one is to allow to the market only products with a positive risk balance, and where this doesn't exist, to take regulatory action. At one extreme, to take them off the market, to issue a warning, to change the label or the SPC. Very important is his communicatory role. To communicate information not only to healthcare professionals so that they can prescribe drugs well, but also to patients so that the patients can take their medicines appropriately. There is a slight difference in approach which Europe has from United States with respect to the provision of information for patients. It's something which Europe has taken seriously for quite a long time, and FDA is doing a very valiant act at catching up now, because this is clearly an important area. But what is new in regulatory science and the role of the regulator is his role in encouraging innovation. The first of these, the benefit risk. This diagram shows on this axis benefit risk. This is not very good. Benefit risk balance and time along here. The benefit risk balance at the time of approval, I've been told not to move, the time of approval, the benefit risk balance is optimal. But with time, after approval and clinical usage, this can change. It usually declines. The reason it declines is because of an increase in variability of response. Very simple, very obvious. Why should there be this variability? Well, there are several reasons, but the two very important ones are after approval, inappropriate prescribing occurs, drug-drug interactions, and secondly, low adherence. Adherence to medicines is the biggest single problem in therapeutics today. It is the biggest single problem in regulation. It is everybody's problem, but nobody's problem. Currently, with the way that medicines are regulated in the current system, with using intention to treat, the regulator is not too concerned about adherence. Provided it's about 70%, they're quite happy. Is it the healthcare professional's problem? Of course it should be, but he may well be too difficult to pick up on this. So it comes down to a personal problem. And last week, we had a very interesting meeting at the Academy of Medical Sciences on adherence, and the results of that will be, the outcome of that will be published shortly. And I think that this is something which has got to rise up the agenda. The other role which I want to just mention is this question of innovation, because this is quite new for the regulator. Now, of course, innovation means different things to different people. It's something which will either cure or prevent a disease, something which will decrease morbidity or mortality, decrease the cost of care, improve the quality of life, increase safety or increase patient adherence or compliance. Each of these are legitimate innovations. And this is a diagram which the accountants PricewaterhouseCoopers published a couple of years ago. And what was it? This was entitled was The Referees of Innovation. This is the life cycle of a medicine, research and development taking 12 years, sales and marketing about 7. This is when money is being spent, and this is where money is being gained. You can see the time when money is being gained here, spent along there. And you can see that according to this diagram, there are 6 referees. Clearly, at this stage in development, there is the researcher, the investor, and the regulator who will decide, give a decision whether to approve the medicine or not. And in the 7 years here, there is the manufacturer who continues the making the medicine and profiting from it, and the payer and the provider. Now, I would put it to you that this diagram is entirely out of date, because the role of the regulator is quite different. The role of the regulator encompasses the whole of these 20 years. The regulator will give scientific advice at the beginning here. He will certainly give approval or non-approval here, and he is responsible for the post-marketing monitoring of effectiveness and safety as well. So the regulator has got a new role in terms of innovation. The second point which I want to make about regulatory science is somewhat different. Duncan showed this slide in a slightly different form, and you've all seen it before. This is a cartoon of how drugs are developed and regulated. The drug starting, preclinical studies in a test tube, preclinical animal studies, regulatory approval before it goes into phase 1. You see the time scales here. Before going into the time when it is assessed for its therapeutic value, phase 2, and the long, expensive phase of clinical trials, coming up again to regulatory approval or not, and then phase 4, post-marketing monitoring of safety and effectiveness. This is essentially a binary situation. This is the crunch situation here, whether the regulator will give approval or not. It's a long process. It's an expensive one. And although most of the medicines that we use successfully today have gone through this process, even though that has happened, it is not all that successful. It is not all that successful. Let me show you why. This is a diagram of expenditure, development times, pharmaceutical sales in the first decade of this century. The top line here in yellow shows drug usage increasing all the time. The second line in orange is money spent on research and development, increasing, tending to flatten off at the end of the decade. Development time, pretty flat, about the same. But the important thing is if you look at the number of new medicines, new molecular entities which are approved, 30% less here than at the beginning of the decade, in spite of this huge increase in R&D. But there's another change as well. This is the same data, the same decade, first decade of this century, the number of new molecular entities. The orange represent chemically based drugs, and the green represent biopharmaceuticals. This is the decline in the total overall drug and in new molecular entities approved. And you will see that proportionally there has been quite a dramatic increase in the number of biopharmaceutical products. Now, this has got some other consequences. If you accept that biopharmaceuticals are a very important part of the industry's armamentarium, clearly they are more expensive to produce. It's an expensive game to get into biopharmaceuticals. And secondly, they will be prescribed less often than chemical drugs. The new drugs which are available, for example, treating pulmonary hypertension, the new biopharmaceuticals given to a high number, hundreds of patients, whereas a new statin will be given to millions of patients. So therefore, the price will be higher. They are the things which cause NICE all the problems. The prices will be higher. But the very important issue is that these biopharmaceuticals not only have the potential, but will treat the cause of the disease as well as the symptoms, and they will cure diseases. They will cure some cancers. They will cure inflammatory disease, which chemical-based drugs will not. They will cure infective processes. And so therefore, there is a demand, both from healthcare professionals and from patients, to get early access to them. They don't want to wait the 10 years to get 12 years to get access to these drugs. And pressure is being put on regulators to approve them sooner. I guess this is a movement which started in the late 1980s, 1990s, with the advent of drugs for HIV disease, although these were chemically based drugs, but it has been exacerbated and accelerated with biopharmaceuticals. This movement causes the regulators problems. If he grants patient access to these powerful new drugs early, then he runs the risk of ignoring patient safety. There is not much patient safety data available. If, on the other hand, he is impressed by the lack of patient safety, he is standing in the way of medical progress. So this is a dilemma that the regulator faces. What are the new regulatory pathways which have been adapted and adopted to accommodate these new type of drugs? Well, there are two. There are firstly what I would call the incremental ones. And these are based on the cartoon which I showed you before, but compressing it a bit. And these are the ones in Europe. The names are here: conditional marketing authorization, accelerated assessment, and these are the US names for the same thing. What is new is a totally new methodology, what I would call a disruptive methodology, and this is adaptive licensing, which Duncan referred to. Adaptive licensing is quite different from the rest. It is different to the traditional methods. The binary approach, which I mentioned in the cartoon, has gone. It's been replaced by a series of stepwise approval stages, small stages for limited indications. There has got to be an acceptance of uncertainty. The amount of data available is not as much, and there is reduced levels of evidence. It's what Lou Scheiner in San Francisco in the 1990s, the late Lou Scheiner, called learn and confirm. Learn studies and then confirm studies. And it has been replaced by iterative phases, exploratory and confirmatory trials, replacing the phase 1 to 4. And then with the very important post-authorization effectiveness and safety studies. And there are two other very important things in planning adaptive licensing. In planning these studies, it is not just a matter of a dialogue between the regulator and the industry. HTA is involved in this as well. This is what the pattern will be and is. The HTA has got to be able to get some data at the end of this process in order to reach some payer-based decisions. And secondly, because the studies are small, the question of patient adherence is critical. We cannot accommodate merely 70% adherence or not. And so the new technologies for ascertaining adherence, such as the Proteus therapeutics devices, which some of you will be familiar with, are going to become critically important tools in adaptive licensing. This is a diagram which Richard Barker has made up for adaptive licensing. Here you have the exploratory and confirmatory trials with review and design here, small trials, leading to limited patient access, repeated iterative studies to establish the relative value, and early access on condition of further data collection. And this is the submission and confirmatory approval. And this is quite a useful diagram to illustrate what is meant by adaptive licensing. And I would submit to you that this is disruptive technology. This is regulation changing to accommodate a new breed of medicines. It is not as if this is only going to be used, I believe, for drugs of great need, orphan drugs. This, I believe, may well become the norm for regulation and development of medicines. And this is a debate which is going on just now as to how widespread this new approach will be. In order to accommodate this, there is a need for data on post-marketing effectiveness and post-marketing safety. How is this data going to be obtained? Well, patient records, obviously. Electronic health records have been widely recommended as the basis for this. But here there are major problems. Electronic health records, especially in the United States, where they were largely pioneered, were designed in order that payments could be made between the patient, the doctor, and other parties. They were not the source of medical data, and many of them are still not. At the last count, there were about 1,200 different electronic health records systems within the United States. Most of them cannot communicate with each other either, which is another problem. So once we have electronic medical records, and there's a big movement in UK as elsewhere to produce that, these may become valuable tools. The second database for what I call real-life data are CPRD, the Clinical Practice Research Data Link, run by the MHRA, and in the United States, Sentinel. Sentinel is the big data database set up under the FDA 3As in 2007. There is a series of mini Sentinel projects just now, which are very impressive. Secondly, it is likely that most patients with these expensive pharmaceutical medicines will go onto registries. These can be interrogated and the data used, and that is important. There are then pragmatic clinical trials, by which I mean clinical trials using real-life data. We're just feeling our way to that. But the remainder of this talk I want to spend talking about what I believe is the most important change, or potential important change, in regulation for many years, and that is the use of social media. Social media will become an incredibly powerful tool in the regulatory world. It is the voice of the patient which is going to be increasingly important. Now, if I was a patient and I wanted to find out, for example, about the safety of a medicine, I would take out the SPC or the label of the medicine and look at that and look at the list of adverse reactions. But these are not what patients complain about. This is information which the patient gives to the doctor, and the doctor interprets it. And there is very, very good evidence that the way in which healthcare professionals interpret what the patients say may be quite different from what the patient means himself. Here is some data from 350 patients in the Sloan Kettering Cancer Institute in New York relative to fatigue, the cumulative incidence on the vertical axis and time along the horizontal. And you can see there's about a 30% difference in the interpretation which the clinician puts on the complaint which the patient has made, the clinician underestimating that. And if you look at a whole lot of other symptoms, fatigue on the top, but these are common symptoms for patients on cancer treatment. The strength of concordance and the figures here, you can see it's about 20 or 30% of the complaints which the patient makes come into to what the clinician would approve of and go into the database. Now, it's not as if there are a lack of other methodologies to get patient data. In fact, both the FDA and the EMA and the MHRA are very keen on patient-related outcomes. These are thought to be very important. And one of the most important of these, I believe, is what I've called social media. And just let me read out the definition of social media. Social media is the social interaction among people in which they create, share, or exchange information or ideas in virtual communities. 10% of all social media is about health, 10%. And at least half of that is about drugs. There are different types of social media. At the last count, there were about 57 that I counted. That was 2 weeks ago, so there may be more by this time. And you'll be familiar with each of these: Wikipedia, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, but there are many more than that. Regulatory authorities are now onto this. Regulatory authorities, the ones I've mentioned, are spending large amounts of money to monitor social media. One of the reasons for this is that for many years we have been obsessed with drug safety. Politicians, the press, everyone, the public, think that drug safety is important. They are not concerned with effectiveness. Once a drug has been approved in a clinical trial in a small proportion of people, small proportion of the population, the long-term effectiveness is thought to be guaranteed. That is not true. And much of the talk in social media is about effectiveness as well as safety. The secret in analyzing social media, of course, is an awful lot of it is nonsense. And there are now some very interesting and important schemes whereby repetition and unimportant parts can be weeded out. And I would predict that social media is going to be a very, very important tool which we are all going to have to take account of. This is some data on medicines withdrawn by the major regulatory authorities since 1965. 163 of them. 162 because of safety considerations, and only 1 because of lack of efficacy. That, I would submit to you, is unrealistic and probably wrong. And we must have better methodology for assessing benefit risk and long-term effectiveness. So, and this echoes Duncan's slide, I believe that modern drug development will change to firstly, better understanding of the molecular pathology of disease, early proof of concept, there will be small targeted clinical studies, and the provision of scientific advice for innovation throughout the life cycle of the medicine by the regulator. So regulation, I would predict, in a few years' time, this is the top line here is what's happening just now, the cartoon which I showed you, which you're familiar with, the length of the line being the length of the project, to something entirely different. This is going to be understanding the pathophysiology, the molecular development, submission, approval, iterative in-life testing to a much shorter period to bring these important new medicines earlier to the market and to the patient. So in summary, ladies and gentlemen, I've highlighted 3 issues only. Firstly, the role of the medicines regulator is changing. Secondly, the pathways of medicines regulation themselves are changing. And thirdly, keep your eye on social media. Thank you very much.